covers all aspects of life, relationship, and success. And I'm your host, Dr. Anna Elton. And we have a special guest tonight. Her name is Dr. Courtney Speropolous, and she is a licensed mental health therapist. I'm marriage therapist. So she's a mental health therapist. She's a certified sex therapist and also clinical sexologist, which I love. And tonight we'll talk about trauma, sexuality, and abusive relationships. Thank you, Courtney, for being here. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you, Anna, for having me. Thank you so much.
So let's talk about difficult subjects. I know I always bring our guests here and we talk about fun things, but we also talk about things that no one wants to talk about or no one knows where to learn about it. So when we think about abusive relationships, what is one misconception that people usually think of?
People think when they think about abusive relationships that people are really choosing to stay, when truly the issue is that there's pretty serious mechanisms underlying being abused or neglected that often physiologically tie the survivor to the perpetrator. And also, if we look at the statistics, 41% of women have experienced contact violence, stalking, or sexual violence by a partner, and 26% of men have experienced contact violence, stalking, or sexual violence by a partner. And so the data and the research with this is really skewed because it's often underreported due to shame and misconceptions about defining abuse, especially verbal and emotional abuse, because people think that it's not, severe enough or significant enough to reconcile as abuse. So people think that it's a weakness that people stay, and people have a lot of shame about it, but they don't realize that it's a public health crisis because a lot of people are grappling with it.
Absolutely. So abuse is huge, right? And then
Yes.
From the statistics, we see that a lot of women experience abuse and not as many men, but I feel like it's definitely more men can report it, but they just simply don't want to think what is abuse. And I definitely have a lot of clients who reported emotional abuse in therapy, but not anywhere else.
Mm-hmm. And that's the thing, because things like emotional abuse and verbal abuse and sexual abuse are very common for both men and women, but especially for men, there's shame with indicating that they've been abused. They don't want to say that that's happened, that somebody could have power and control, and I think that there's a lot of in value systems, we don't think that either gender could be, either the perpetrator or the abuser, but it can go both ways. The research has really indicated that abuse is as common and even a little bit more common even in LGBTQIA spheres as well. So we see a lot of domestic abuse and coercive control, in those types of relationships. It's not even just heterosexual relationships, it's all types of relationships.
So it's across all the relationships, right?
Yes.
How about healing? What is the first sign of healing?
Getting angry. If you start to get really angry at your abuser or what has happened to you, that's a really good indicator that self-esteem is starting to come online, and our defensive mechanism that basically says we're worthy of protection is online. And that's the first sign that maybe somebody is in a good place to start the healing process from a domestically violent relationship.
It's so interesting. So when you think of, I don't know, always connected to stages of grief, right? If you grieve in a relationship or old version of self, do you feel like it's connected to stages of grief in any way or no?
I do, yeah, because if we look at the stages of grief, it starts with denial. And usually, on the opposite side, to get out of denial, we need awareness. And a lot of individuals start their journey with getting out of a domestic violence situation with becoming aware of what exactly is domestic abuse, all the different forms of abuse. And usually it has to start with awareness in order to get the trajectory anywhere. And within getting that awareness is when people get angry. So yes, that would definitely coincide with the grief, because a lot of people in these situations are grieving good person, bad person. You've got two losses that you've got to reconcile: the good part of somebody and the bad part of somebody. And they're angry at the bad
in that relationship, right?
Yeah.
Because you can always see something good in that relationship and why you stay that long, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe there's still something good about your partner.
Yeah. Well, a lot of times in domestic violence, like we're looking at cycles. We're looking at a lot of times like what we think is like the good person, we're looking at like the love bombing phase or the honeymoon phase. And then it often switches to kind of like the devaluation phase, like when they start utilizing different forms of abuse to kind of rip somebody of like their sense of security within oneself or worth within oneself. And then we go to like the discard phase. And then it kind of, which means that they might, do something that would cause the relationship to absolve, or they would just completely leave you and leave the person to stabilize. And then they come back and then they love bomb. So a lot of times the good part is the part that was the love bomb part. But that's like the cycle of the relationship. The love bomb is usually manipulation. It's to get somebody to submit.
Interesting. So, from your experience, love bombing stage, how long does it last? Does it
It
really depend on
depends.
the couple? Or?
It depends. Like I had a patient one time who was together with somebody for 2 years, and once they got married, once it was solid, then the abuse started. Some perpetrators, they have a very, very short shelf life of being able to regulate themselves enough to love bomb. So but one thing that we know for certain is like there's going to be like insidious signs. Some of the very early warning signs are like somebody being insensitive, minimizing feelings, invalidating, deflecting, playing dumb. That becomes like a really big one. That's a huge part of like the gaslighting campaign. Um, so usually you can tell if like somebody is not terribly tender and kind to like your feedback or being sensitive to your emotions. That's usually a pretty good sign that maybe the love bombing won't last. And people see like glimmers through the love bombing, but it doesn't feel like getting called a bad word or blatant emotionally abusive things. It's more like small scale stuff at first.
I'm just wondering, so if you differentiate abuse from someone who, maybe really simply don't know how to respond to emotions, what's the difference? Because, maybe they say like my partner's not emotionally available versus my partner's abuse.
What differentiates it is the need for power and control.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes people do, it's a normal thing to get overwhelmed in conflict because when you love somebody, the stakes are high. And so sometimes like people get glimmers of shame when they're in an interaction getting feedback, and maybe at first they're really overwhelmed and startled by things and like they might get defensive, contemptuous, stonewall, or defensive. But what we see is though is that like at the core of it, they really do have a desire for equality and fairness and connection in the relationship. And so at least, maybe in that moment when they're really overwhelmed and they're using, what we call like the four horsemen of the apocalypse, like in conflict, we'll see afterwards they have the ability to like take accountability, they have remorse, they show regret, and they're able to loop back around and say, listen, I really didn't handle that well. You mean a lot to me, and I need to take accountability for that. There is no such thing as accountability in abusive relationships unless it's a manipulation tactic. And they will only take accountability just so that they can maintain control over somebody again. So the difference between a healthy relationship and an abusive relationship is change. Like when somebody apologizes and tries to reconcile, oftentimes we do see somebody who's proactively trying to change and be sensitive to the other partner. In abusive dynamics, it will be maybe like a half-fledged apology, but we're going to see the same behaviors over and over again. And what happens is usually after the apology, the perpetrator gets pissed off, like after a little bit of time, and then they get retaliatory. So they do something 10 times worse because you made them go into a weak position of apology. So we're going to see it, you're going to know it's abusive because after apologies and reconciliation, we're going to see even worse behaviors afterwards versus like in healthy relationships. Like after a repair, there's insight development and there's more change because of the accountability.
Interesting. So usually the user would say, well, I'm sorry that this happened. what can make me upset, right?
Yes.
It's your fault, right? It's always going on the person who quote unquote made them feel this way. And it's so interesting. I see this with toddlers, right? I see this with young kids. And I always, so I have three kids, and like whenever my 7-year-old, now he's 7, he was 6, 7, now he's 7. And whenever he says, like, oh, my older brother, he made me scream, right? He made me do this. I was like, no, no one makes you do this.
Yeah.
You can say things, you can ignore it. No one makes you think, say this or do this, right? So that's one. And I always say, you need to be accountable for your actions. And it starts early on, but then we see adults who are not able to be accountable for their actions.
Accountability is a challenge to control because relinquishing accountability means that you and I are on the same playing field. I'm not above you, and you're not below me. And that is intolerable for somebody who's abusive. It cannot, but for them, being in a relationship is about validation, admiration, and unquestioning loyalty. So if you have thoughts, feelings, and opinions that are contrary to my program, or, if you challenge my authority at all, that's a direct assault to their, ego and their sense of their own safety, because they're usually utilizing relationships as kind of like a source of supply to regulate themselves, because at the core, they struggle with intense internal dysregulation and other type of pathology that has to do with like their issues with neurochemistry. So
Interesting. So how about neurodivergent clients? Is there a difference? How can you tell if the client is neurodivergent, they just can't feel empathy or they can't read the room versus they're being abusive partner?
well, I think a main difference is that with abusive people, uh, it's like a lot of survivors of domestic violence will often say it's almost like the person reveled in abusing me.
Mhm.
They get a dopamine spike and they get a reward from perpetrating abuse. Like you and I, we might feel good, giving bread to like a bird or something like that, like feeding an animal might feel like a really pleasurable activity, right? We get dopamine release from that. Having some ice cream, the way that their brain kind of regulates is actually they get joy and they feel regulated, hurting somebody else versus somebody who might just be neurodivergent. They're not really getting joy or feeling regulated after perpetrating harm on somebody. And maybe they don't understand it, like maybe the emotions are slow to come in neurodivergence, like especially around issues of like empathy in the moment. But over time, like, they are able to kind of process that and it's not a challenge for them to take accountability. Like maybe they don't understand social nuances and caveats at first, but the reason why they might be insensitive is very different, and they're not doing it out of power and control like somebody. Because like what we're looking at is there's a difference between somebody who's like neurodivergent, like having autism or ADHD, versus somebody who's a perpetrator of domestic violence. Those folk, 80% of batters that go to batters intervention, there was a study that was done in 2021. They found that 80% of them have a cluster B personality disorder. So that's like our erratic and dramatic crew, and like our antisocials, borderlines, narcissistic, and histrionic folk. And it's just very, very, very different from, it could be considered a form of neurodivergence in its own sense, I guess. Like in old school medical journals, Axis 3 diagnoses were, which is what a cluster B personality disorder is. In old school medical journals, that was mental retardation. Of course, they've changed it since that point. But if we look at the same vein, like they kind of have emotional retardation. If we're looking at it because they're having significant deficits in empathy, impulse control, forethought, things of that nature. And there's, again, like there's some brain abnormalities there that kind of cause those behaviors. So they are neurodivergent in their own way, but not like typical neurotypicals, if that makes sense.
Interesting. Okay. I was just wondering. I was just thinking
Yeah.
about different types of clients, right? And
Yeah.
think of someone who's saying, well, like I was abused versus my partner just simply, has a really hard time being empathetic towards me.
This is a pattern of behavior to dominate somebody else.
Mm.
and to basically demoralize somebody else. It's essentially like a campaign of chaos. You know, people that are in abusive situations often feel like it's like a bolt in a blender. And that's usually when I can tell that a patient is in a domestically violence relationship, because usually it's always they're feeling a lot of confusion and chaos and internal unrest. They can't stay, but they can't go. And it's usually a pattern that if you do speak up for yourself, it gets worse, which is why a lot of people end up staying in a relationship, because leaving is also incredibly dangerous. So
So
that's how I
from
would differentiate it if I was doing couples work.
I see. So from your work, what do you see most? Do you see physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, financial abuse, or any other type of abuse?
Well, a lot of times, most abuses roll together because
Mhm.
of like the nature of abuse. So it's a pretty good indicator if things are starting off to be like emotionally and verbally abusive. At some point in the relationship, we're probably going to see, sexual, physical, or financial abuse, because like the utilization of abuse is a regulatory strategy for the perpetrator, and it's very gradual. Like emotional and verbal abuse work to get regulated at first and to maintain power and control, but they kind of got to up the ante, so they use more aggressive forms of abuse to kind of do that over time. So, what do I see? Um, you know, I see in my practice personally a lot of sexual abuse and infidelity, because that's what I advertise for. That's what I market for. Before I started marketing for it, I saw a lot of emotional and verbal abuse, and then there would be like sporadic incidences of physical. Usually, when physical violence occurs, that's when everybody kind of knows, oh, I'm in an abusive relationship. A
Mhm.
lot of people don't take being cheated on or non consensual sexual activities, they don't take those as abuse
Mhm.
or domestic violence. And a lot of verbal and emotional abuse, people don't recount as abuse either. But psychologically, any form of abuse is deteriorating, and it changes the way that our brain operates. It doesn't matter if I get punched in both eyes, if I get cheated on, if I get called bad words, or if I'm chronically invalidated and put down for having feelings. What it's going to do to my neurobiology is going to be the same in all instances. I'm going to get an overactivation of like the part of the brain where like my fear response is, and it's going to put offline the part of my brain that I can see things clearly and make decisions for myself.
I
And
see.
that's how coercive control kind of works, because any form of abuse, think about like the brain is a muscle of its own, and it works by blood flow. And, whatever gets activated gets stronger. So this is the frontal lobe. This is where empathy, emotional regulation, long term planning, impulse control, problem solving, all the good stuff lives here, angel part of the brain. Back here, this is devil part of the brain, like kind of like stupid ass part of the brain. This is where when we're traumatized, we're having anxiety, we're having depression. If I call you a bad word and I put you down, or I constantly invalidate you or gaslight you, what I do is we get more instances of blood activation from our frontal lobe to the back part of our brain. And the more that we get blood flow, it's a muscle. It's going to get real strong back here, and we're going to get into a fixed response of being back here. So what happens is over time, progressively being in an abusive relationship, it gets very strong in this part of the brain, which is the trauma response, which is our survival response, and it gets very weak in the part that can plan and see things clearly and get out.
Mhm.
So you all the times that you get abused, it strengthens the part of the brain so that that person can maintain control. That's how sometimes people can stay in abusive relationships for 20, 30, 40 years.
So how do you break the cycle? So if this one is really strong and this one is
Yep.
not, so is it usually someone else points out, or you realize at some point?
Usually, like I said, when it gets to like physical abuse, people are usually able to say, wow, or they become like a shell of a person. We get on the other side, they're incredibly non functional, very depressed, very anxious, like maybe they're riddled with flashbacks. Their quality of life is significantly low. And sometimes we get people that unfortunately survivors that they want to commit suicide And so that becomes like the first indicator to them something is not right, something is very wrong with me. And then when they avail themselves to practitioners, that's usually when the exploration about their environment and what is going on might start to happen. Or maybe they were physically abused and they're able to say, oh, that is abuse. And they might, get the courage to tell somebody around them, listen, this is kind of going on for me. But a lot of times, people going through the situation are very, very, very ashamed because they think that the abuse that is happening to them is because of who they are and things that they've done, which is completely not true, Um, but it becomes like an incredible barrier for like seeking assistance. But usually it starts with awareness, like something is really wrong here. And then then it goes to maybe getting educated. Maybe they just think they have an arbitrary mental health related issue. Oh, I'm just struggling with anxiety, or I'm just like suicidal. And again, it's my fault. And then they might end up meeting people or getting some information and realizing, oh, I'm in an abusive relationship.
And what's interesting, if you have children, they tend to model the behavior, right? And then at some point you can have not one abuser but multiple abusers without them realizing, right? They have to keep in. And then they also can do the same thing in their adult relationship as well. So you're at one where you want to break the cycle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like a lot of times too, like kids will try to identify with the more powerful parent, and they'll also kind of be part of the crew that like demoralizes the parent that's getting perpetrated. And it's a way for them to remain safe because like if they're in opposition to the parent that has more power and control, they could also be, in line to get some of that abuse and neglect as well. So they're trying to maintain safety, but then in that identification, then they grow up, with those patterns. So it is true that a majority of perpetrators did grow up in homes that had some semblance of domestic violence or abuse or neglect. And so.
So, from your experience, have you seen any partners who are abusive who were able to pause, and take all the help, accept all the help they can to make changes and have more healthy relationship? Or usually, if you're in an abusive relationship, you need to get out.
It's very, 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 very seldom. Mm-hmm. If the perpetrating partner is more like borderline, we have a much higher likelihood that, because their issue is more about like they have abandonment issues and they have like a severe dysregulation, but like they have more empathy. Like it is kind of situational because like when they get dysregulated, the empathy goes offline, but they do tend to have high empathy the majority of the time. Those folk, you see more changes with them if they're in that type of dynamic with a partner. But if we have like a antisocial or a more narcissistic presenting partner, I mean the chances of the likelihood of change is very low because they're very high on neuroticism, which means having big feelings, but they're very low on self-awareness. So they have an extreme inability to kind of see themselves as they are. And realistically, their symptomology, it only bothers them as much as like they can't get anybody to be a part of their program. They really don't care if somebody else is hurt and devastated over their behavior. So they have a very low motivation to change. And they also have a very low motivation to stay inside of any type of self-help program. The only time that you would see somebody who's narcissistic usually stay in therapy is when everybody in their social sphere no longer wants to deal with them, and they go to therapy usually to learn new social skills, aka manipulation tactics, to learn to reconcile and appease long enough so that they can gain control back. But it does not change ever their orientation towards the need for power and control. It's never about mutuality, reciprocity, having mutual goals, and respecting each other's autonomy. That's just not something that they're very capable of. They can learn to mask it and maybe emulate some of those behaviors, but the true facets of like intimacy that most healthy people with a healthy empathy system would experience, they're not going to experience that. A lot of it's going to be for show, and they're going to constantly be trying to quell that desire to do things that are not so wonderful for relationships.
Interesting. So on the outside, they appear as perfect partners, and as you were speaking, I'm thinking about this new movie, and it's not so new, but Housemaid.
Yes.
And is it something similar? Is this is what you can see? I mean, I know this is the extreme example, right, of
Yes.
the abuser, but you know, he was the
Yes.
perfect, charming, right, and then he made her appear as the crazy one.
And that's usually how abuse is facilitated. The housemaid was incredible because that is usually how it goes. They have a public persona and then a private life. And the public persona is another part of the gaslighting campaign. What do you mean, Cheryl? Everybody else at the office loves me. Everybody else thinks I'm great. You're the only one who has a complaint about me. You're the only one that says this. My boss loves me. My assistant loves me. This one loves me. I kiss babies on the street corner. You're crazy. Even your sister says you're crazy. Even your brother thinks that you're crazy. It's you. Because look at me. So they spend like a lot of time coming up with this image, but it's really a facade. It is not true at all of who they are. But again, like, it's just like, and that's the thing that's really destabilizing for the survivor, because nobody else sees what they see. Nobody else usually experiences what they're experiencing. And so that kind of creates another barrier when it comes. That's what also kind of fuels like the shame and the self doubt and all those things too, because he's usually probably Mr. Nice Guy. He's the guy that will snow blow for the neighbors across the street, you know? But
And
he's the guy
they
that
do
you
this
ask.
to kind of create all the evidences that I'm a good guy, or like sometimes I'm a good woman, right? I don't want to say the position
Yeah,
of the man, right? Could be both.
yep. It is. It is because it's a persona. It's another manipulation tactic. And it's another way that they're able to kind of like keep the abuse going on. And we see it a lot. Like, we see it in media, like people, it's image management, and it's a big, big, big thing for abusers. And that's another thing. Like, that's why they get more dangerous when people usually call out their abuse, because it challenges, it's called like a false reality. And so basically it's a part of the gaslighting campaign. And basically they try to um, make the survivor believe about them what they believe about them, this like false narrative. And it can feel like you're in a whole nother world with the abuser, a fake world where basically like they get to define what everything is, even though it's not that thing. So that becomes like very, very, very hard and scary, because when people are getting out of, an abusive relationship, they have a hard time understanding who they were, because like being in that relationship, the abuser got to define every part of them. And if they didn't accept that, then they would get hurt, destabilized, and further demoralized.
So another thing I was thinking as you were speaking, right? How about substances? Because I definitely seen couples who, you know, had a good relationship and then one partner started using substances and then it affected their chemistry, right? And if they were originally really a compassionate person, you know, good partner, and then all of a sudden you see you know, certain qualities you see, you know, borderline tendencies, bipolar tendencies, right, narcissistic tendencies, and it's almost like you have a partner who you don't even know who this person is, and I'm thinking, you know, Coraline, you know, this the person with the buttons, right? Like I don't know who's this person in front of me, but then also, you know, the same couple who, you know, if the partner who used substances went to the treatment and then was able to get back and reconcile the couple's relationship. So I'm just thinking like it also depends like what happened, like how did it all started, right? The abuse. Is it something that's always been there, you know, from the start? Is it childhood trauma that's affecting him? Is it personality disorder? Or it's maybe substances, right? That's affecting personality right now and that person just needs help.
Yeah. Usually, abuse is perpetrated by individuals. Like 80% is people that have personality disorders, which are like enduring personality features. You're right, though, if substance use is a new thing, that's going to destabilize the brain. I mean, it's a natural inhibitor of like the frontal lobe. So that makes like a lot of sense, like why they might use abusive techniques when they're not a truly abusive person. But sometimes people think that the abuse is related to substance use, and then when they find out, because a lot of people that have personality disorders also have a comorbid substance use problem.
And unfortunately, there's a lot of things, right? Bipolar goes with infidelity and substance use, and then other things, and it's a big mix.
So the thing is that like sometimes when people get sober, then they still find that the abuse is still there. So that's when it kind of becomes like a complicated feature, because realistically, like no form of abuse is gonna work long term for any type of relationship. So I would just say like having awareness of like types of abuse. Like I think that it is important to figure like I think it's really important to like have a no abuse policy, because regardless of like what is going on, childhood trauma, this, that, or the third, it's never an excuse to abuse. You're essentially causing somebody to, like temporary brain damage. There is no reason why there is just no reconcilable reason. Like we're all personally accountable for how we show up to relationships. And that's an important thing I think for like survivors to kind of understand is like a lot of times what keeps people in abusive relationships is making excuses for the abuser. Oh yeah, like his father was an alcoholic, he used to beat the hell out of him, or she was raped in childhood and that's why she's this way, and do. And yes, we all have like personal histories, but we're accountable to how we show up in a relationship. We might be dysregulated, not in a good way, have a short fuse and all those different things, but are we able to like apologize and mean it, be sensitive, have regret and remorse for what we did, and really work to never do those behaviors ever again, to never cause that type of damage ever again? That's what's going to be the difference between like somebody who's just like not in a good way for a period of time versus somebody that's like abusive. Because it's true, we all have seasons of suffering and we might act less than ideal, but we're really looking at like being clear on the pattern, and that there's a no abuse policy. Anything that can disrupt our neurobiology and can change the course of how we function and operate, that's a no. That just cannot happen in relationships.
So maybe one thing that anyone's watching us, they can start with taking a piece of paper, and on one side they write things that they want to look in a relationship, right? On the other side they can write all the things they don't want to see, right? Absolutely no. And then the middle is the gray area. So at least when they're in the moment, they can't find excuses. They can look at their piece of paper or can rewind that piece of paper and say like, okay, where do I stand? What type of situation am I in? And then they can define, is it abusive or not? Because when you're in a situation, it's a little hard to define it versus when you do this work prior to being in the situation.
Right. My suggestion is like for people to really like print out the definitions of certain types of abuse. All the types of abuse: emotional, verbal, sexual. Especially now, like sexual abuse is really expanded with like the digital age and digital micro cheating, and like even just like digital sexual boundary crossing. Like we have a lot more things that are other forms of like emotional abuse that were and sexual abuse that were overlooked before. So like I would really get my hands on like a list of all the different types of abuse and get educated on that, because most people want to do the right thing. It's just there isn't like a lot of education. So just in general, like even if people are not in abusive relationships, like the juice might be worth the squeeze. Looking at this stuff anyway, just to see like where all of us are borderlining and teetering, just to kind of take it seriously that these behaviors can be really destabilizing and harmful for somebody else. So like if you understand that when it comes to conflict or being upset about something, maybe we know those things are off limits. It's kind of like getting back to like what is fair and what is not fair. It's not fair to use abuse. So what's like another strategy? And you have to know what it is at first. Everybody's got to know what it is so that we don't do it. Absolutely. And to know if you're dealing with it.
So then one topic we haven't touched a lot: how about sexuality? Sexuality after trauma, after abuse, what happens to it?
So, our brain is our biggest sex organ, and that's where sexual fantasy kind of comes out of, and our nervous system is connected to our brain. And so, with what I said about what trauma kind of, or what abuse does to the brain, and how it impacts the nervous system, A lot of times when after abuse, people are in like a chronic like fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response, or they might experience something called somatic dissociation or disembodiment, which means that they're not connected to their body. Their body feels numb, it's offline. They might have an issue with like hunger cues, so you might see like significant weight loss and all those different types of things. And their body is like offline to even like genital stimulation and sensations. Or they might just be like so anxious or dysregulated, like they don't have a desire to have sex. Or if it was sexual abuse or if it was infidelity, which is a form of sexual abuse, they might have some internalized sexual messaging around like, there's something really wrong with me, I wasn't good enough, I'm defective, I don't own my sexuality. If they were sexually abused or sexually assaulted, there was things that were non-consensually done to them. They just don't feel ownership of themselves anymore. So we get sexual dysfunction and we get like an aversion, but then in a few folk, we get hypersexuality, so, and it's just a response to trauma. It's nothing to be ashamed of. It's just that people, it's a maladaptive way of reclaiming ownership, but they might go around and have multiple different sex partners. And like, that might be a way to like, kind of, their best efforts to regulate the nervous system. So we either get like avoidance, or we get hypersexuality, or some people get like vaginal pain. We might get erectile dysfunction. We might get premature ejaculation or delayed ejaculation. Like, we get all different types of sexual dysfunctions that come from a disrupted nervous system from abuse.
Yeah, there's a lot, right?
There are
I'm
a lot.
just wondering, so what is
Yeah.
hypersexuality? So, I mean, some people would say like, oh, well, cool, my partner is always available, right? And
Yeah.
always wants to be intimate. This is great. So what would be the problem? How would you define the problem?
Well, for a survivor of domestic violence, when it comes to hypersexuality, like a lot of it is a short term. It's basically a very short term strategy to be able to feel like they have control over themselves, but they end up participating in more risky sexual behavior, maybe with multiple partners, or maybe if like they were in the right, if they were in their frontal lobe with things, maybe that wouldn't have been the choice. And so the difference between like having a high sexual appetite when you're in a healthy relationship versus like hypersexuality is usually it's you kind of have a little bit of like a lack of control. It's kind of like being in a pseudo manic episode.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of know that it's happening and you kind of see it rising and going, but it is exhilarating because you felt so low and demoralized for such a period of time. It's kind of like people often say after being like having a hypersexual attitude, they feel a lot of like shame and embarrassment and guilt, and they feel kind of sick about it. Just because at that time it seemed like a really great idea, but it wasn't like the healthiest way that they felt like they could claim ownership. They were only doing it because they were hurting. And then in the midst of doing that, maybe they were with other people, even if it was consensual sex. Maybe it wasn't done for like the right reasons, like intimacy, connection. A lot of it was like thrill seeking and a regulatory strategy.
Oh, interesting. So thank you for sharing. It was absolutely amazing. So as we start wrapping up, is there any final piece of advice you can offer to our viewers? So what's the first step to healing? What's the first step to get out of that cycle?
Is awareness. The first step is going to be awareness. Awareness of what kind of abuse occurred, and also understanding that it was the perpetrator's choice to utilize abuse so that they could regulate. It had nothing to do with you, although you were afflicted by that situation. There was nothing about you particularly that caused them to act in an abusive manner. Like, it was, a lot of it has to do with their own internal pathology and issues with organic brain chemistry and personality deficits, like trait deficits. And the only thing that you were guilty of was loving somebody. That's it. You love somebody who looked normal on the outside, but as their relationship kind of went on, you kind of found that they had a lot of, regulatory issues and interpersonal deficits. And, you're not going to feel like this forever. Like, there are strategies that you can utilize to calm your body, to get back in touch with your body. The flashbacks will reduce by doing somatic therapy. seeing a good practitioner, sharing your story with other people, avoiding isolation, getting back to understand what is beautiful and good about you as an individual. And, it's also really important to get back to having healthy, safe, consensual sex or having healthy relationships. Don't avoid it forever. Not everybody is that way. There are really good, healthy people out there that want reciprocity and are respectful, that would really cherish the opportunity to love, to be together with you. So, it's not about what you did, it's about what you do. And there's like an opportunity to heal and move forward. And oftentimes, like after going through, domestic violence or coercive control relationships, people have, an enhanced sense of self, spirituality, connection to others. So post-traumatic growth is kind of like a superpower. And then you come out, you have increased pattern recognition after one relationship, after doing the work. You can kind of spot it a lot quickly. You can become like a beacon of hope for other people, and so you're not going to stay at that darkest point forever. So and there is a way out, and there is a way to have good, healthy relationships after that. You're not broken. And you're actually kind of like a hero. You're superhuman. It takes a lot to get through something like that psychologically when you have somebody that's basically in an inside job trying to destabilize you. And so if you survive, that is tremendous.
That's amazing. And I guess the next part would be not to get in a similar relationship.
Yes.
Right? Because unfortunately, oops, I did it again. Right? That can be the cycle for some people. They can, once they get out of one relationship, they can get into a very similar relationship very soon.
Yep.
And you just need to be more aware, you need to work on yourself, right, and really figure out what's going on.
Yeah. Any sign of confusion or chaos, we're usually talking about this is probably an abusive relationship. Like if you're in the first few months and you're like, oh my goodness, like my spirit is disrupted, I feel incredible anxiety, I feel a lot of confusion and chaos, you're probably in a relationship that's going towards coercive control.
I know we can talk the entire night about it. Right?
Yep.
There's still a lot. But thank you so much for all the information. You're absolutely amazing. If our viewers want to find you, reach out, talk to you, find your book, can you please share your information?
Yes. So people can find me on Psychology Today. So you can put my first and my last name in the search bar on psychologytoday.com. And that brings you just to like my practicing website. I practice out of Massachusetts. But you can send me an email. That's probably preferable to like doing a phone call. And my book is on Amazon. It's called Unfucked. It's a healing workbook for survivors of sexual abuse and infidelity, post-domestically violent relationships. And so you can just go into the search bar on Amazon, and it's UNF asterisk CKED. And it's usually like the first one that comes up. But those would be really great ways. And that workbook is really great for people that maybe it has everything from the tools to be able to recognize abuse, to everything about perpetrator psychology, to understanding betrayal, trauma, and trauma, to being able to come back to like a window of tolerance, like being able to learn how to regulate oneself. Then we have consent frameworks, how to create boundaries, how to get back to having safe consensual sex and envisioning it, even if it's solo work. Basically, it's everything from the beginning to end about how do we heal from sexual abuse and infidelity, most domestically violent relationships.
Absolutely. You're absolutely amazing. Thank you. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for sharing all your knowledge. And thank you for watching. We'll see you guys again in 2 weeks. And have a great night.